The pride and joy 3 summers ago, Lisa started turning her plain backyard into something magical. It wasn't much at first, just a few flower beds and some herbs by the kitchen window. But day by day, weekend after weekend, her little patch of earth transformed into a living painting of colors and scents. Every morning Lisa would wake up before the sun. She'd make her coffee, look out at the morning dew on the leaves and feel a calm happiness that was hard to find anywhere else. By 6, she'd be outside with dirt under her fingernails, completely lost in her work. "My plants don't judge," she would tell her sister during their weekly calls. "They just grow if you love them enough," and love them she did. Lisa knew every plant by heart. Which ones needed shade, which ones were thirsty, which ones attracted butterflies. The tulips that opened like cups of sunshine in spring, the lavender that buzzed with bees in summer, the pumpkin vines that crawled across the ground in fall, hiding orange treasures beneath their bristly leaves. The neighbors started to notice. Mrs. Henderson from across the street would slow her walking pace to peek through the fence slats. The Collins kids would stop their bikes to watch Lisa work, asking a million questions about bugs and seeds and whether the tall sunflowers were as tall as a house yet. "Your garden is like something from a storybook," Mr. Wilson told her one evening as he passed by with his dog. He was right. In just 3 years, what had been a boring square of grass had become a small paradise, with winding paths, hidden benches, and even a tiny pond where frogs sometimes appeared as if by magic. But the real treasures of Lisa's garden were tucked away behind the tool shed. 5 special tomato plants that didn't look like much to strangers but meant the world to her. These weren't store-bought plants or even fancy catalog varieties. These were her grandmother's tomatoes, grown from seeds her family had saved for over 80 years. Gran's rubies, they called them. The fruits grew round and heavy, with a deep red color that almost glowed at dusk. They tasted like summer sunshine and childhood memories, sweet with just the right amount of tang. Every August, Lisa would carefully collect the seeds from the best tomatoes, dry them on paper towels, and store them in little envelopes for next year, just like her grandmother had taught her mother, and her mother had taught her. These tomatoes saw the Great Depression, her grandmother used to say, her wrinkled hands gently tying the plants to their stakes. They saw wars come and go. They'll be here long after we're all gone, feeding someone else's family. Now those tomato plants grew in Lisa's garden, connecting her to something bigger than herself, something that stretched backwards and forwards in time. The local gardening club noticed her garden too. At first, Lisa felt shy when they asked if her yard could be part of their annual tour. Her garden wasn't fancy like the show gardens with their perfect hedges and expensive water features. But when 30 strangers walked her little paths that Saturday in June, their faces lit up with genuine joy. "It feels lived in," one woman said, bending to smell a cluster of herbs. "Like someone actually enjoys this space instead of just showing it off." Another visitor, an older man with dirt-stained hands that matched Lisa's, stood for a long time by the tomato plants. "My mother used to grow something like these," he said softly. "I haven't seen tomatoes like this in 30 years. Lisa smiled and offered him a taste. The look on his face as he bit into the fruit was worth all the backaches and sunburns she'd earned that summer. What most visitors didn't know, what Lisa didn't tell them, was that this garden had saved her in more ways than one. 3 years ago, when her husband of 12 years packed his bags and left without looking back, Lisa had felt like she was drowning on dry land. The house they'd bought together suddenly felt too big, too empty, too full of memories turning sour. The first weeks after he left, she could barely get out of bed. Her sister had to come stay, making sure Lisa ate and showered and went through the motions of living. Then one morning, something shifted. Lisa looked out at the bare, neglected yard and felt a tiny spark of something. Not happiness, not yet, but possibility. That same day, she bought her first packets of seeds and a pair of gardening gloves. The gloves were too big, made for men's hands, but she liked how solid they felt. She dug into the earth with a rented tiller, sweating and cursing as the machine bucked against roots and stones. By sunset, she had turned over one small corner of soil. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. With each seed she planted, each weed she pulled, each harvest she gathered, Lisa felt pieces of herself returning. The garden became a living calendar, marking time in new ways. Not 2 months since he left, but the day the first radishes came up. Not would have been our anniversary, but time to stake the tomatoes. Now 3 years later, her garden had become famous in the neighborhood. Children asked for tours. Neighbors traded plants and advice over the fence. Even the grumpy old man at the corner house had started nodding hello when Lisa walked by with her watering can. And somewhere along the way, without Lisa quite noticing, when it happened, the garden had stopped being just a distraction from her pain. It had become a joy of its own, something that belonged entirely to her, something no one could take away. With each passing season, as her plants grew stronger, and more beautiful, so did she. The brewing conflict, everything changed on a sunny Tuesday in April, when a moving truck pulled up to the house next door. Lisa watched from behind her kitchen curtain as the new neighbor directed the movers with sharp, impatient gestures. He was tall with carefully combed gray hair and clothes that looked like they'd never seen a wrinkle. His name was Alan, and within a week everyone on Oak Street knew it. Alan was the kind of man who introduced himself by telling you what he used to be. Alan Thompson, retired bank manager, he'd say, extending a stiff hand. 27 years. At First National, I ran the downtown branch. His house, like his handshake, was firm and unbending, a neat brick box with sharp corners and straight lines. At first, Lisa tried to be friendly. She brought over a basket of fresh herbs and cherry tomatoes the day after he moved in. Alan accepted the gift with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Homegrown, huh? He said, holding the basket like it might contain something dangerous. I prefer the reliability of store-bought produce myself. You never know what might be crawling in garden vegetables. Lisa laughed it off. Not everyone was a plant person after all. But as spring turned into summer, she realized that Alan wasn't just uninterested in gardening. He seemed personally offended by it. It started with small comments over the fence. Your yard's looking a bit wild there, he'd call out as Lisa pruned her roses. Or, those plants are attracting an awful lot of insects, don't you think? Always with that same tight smile, as if he was being helpful rather than critical. Lisa tried to explain how native plants supported local birds and butterflies, how her garden was actually helping the neighborhood ecosystem. Bugs are part of nature, she told him one evening. Most of them are good for the garden. Alan's smile thinned even more. Well, nature should know its place, and its place isn't in a respectable neighborhood. His own yard made his opinions clear enough. Within 2 weeks of moving in, Alan had hired a professional landscaping company. They came with their roaring machines, tearing out the previous owner's flower beds and replacing them with flat green sod laid down like carpet. Every bush was trimmed into a perfect sphere or cube. Not a leaf dared grow out of line. Twice a week, the lawn service would arrive at exactly 9 a.m. The workers would edge, mow, and blow, creating a yard that looked more like a golf course than a home. Once Lisa overheard Alan instructing the foreman, I want it clean, military corners, nothing messy. The problem might have stayed small if it weren't for the fence between their properties. It was an old wooden fence, weathered and graying, with gaps between the slats where light shone through. Lisa had always liked how her climbing plant softened its hard edges. Purple clematis and orange trumpet vine turned the boundary into something alive and beautiful. But one morning in June, Lisa came out to find several of her vines cut back to stubs, the healthy green tendrils lying wilted on her side of the fence. Your plants were coming through to my property, Alan explained when she knocked on his door, that same tight smile plastered on his face. I have a right to remove anything that crosses the boundary line. You could have just asked me, Lisa said, trying to keep her voice calm. I would have trimmed them back for you. Alan's smile didn't waver. I prefer to handle things directly. By the way, have you considered getting a proper landscaper? Your yard looks like it's one step away from becoming a jungle. After that, the battle lines were drawn. Every morning glory that dared reach toward Alan's yard was cut without mercy. Every leaf that blew onto his perfect lawn was returned, usually with a note about yard maintenance standards. Once, during a rainstorm, he came to her door with an umbrella and a plastic bag containing 3 maple leaves. "These blew over from your tree," he said, water dripping from his jacket onto her welcome mat. Lisa tried to keep the peace. She installed trellises to direct her vines away from the fence. She swept fallen leaves before they could travel. She even planted a row of orderly lavender along the property line as a kind of peace offering. Something structured, but still natural. Alan responded by installing bright motion sensor lights that pointed directly at her garden, claiming they were for security. The harsh beams disrupted the fireflies Lisa loved to watch and confused the night-blooming flowers that perfumed her evening sitting area. The neighbors started to notice the tension. Mrs. Henderson stopped by one afternoon with a plate of cookies and gentle advice. "Don't let him get to you, dear. Some people just can't stand seeing others happy in their own way." The Collins kids made up a song about Mean Mr. Cleanyard that they sang while riding bikes past his house. Even Mr. Wilson with the dog started taking the long way around the block to avoid passing Alan's critical gaze. One evening, Lisa found a thick envelope stuffed in her mailbox. Inside was a printout of the Neighborhood Association guidelines, which hadn't been enforced in 20 years, with sections about yard maintenance and community standards highlighted in angry yellow. At the bottom, Alan had written, "Please review and comply." That night, as she sat on her back porch watching fireflies blink between her treasured plants, Lisa felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. The same heaviness that had followed her divorce, the feeling of someone else trying to control her joy. The next morning, she got up even earlier than usual. With quiet determination, she planted a new row of sunflowers all along the fence. They would grow tall by August, she knew, tall enough to look down on Alan's perfect yard. Bright yellow faces smiling over his surgical green lawn. 2 could play at this game. And Lisa had something Alan didn't have. Patience. The kind you can only learn from watching things grow. The devastating attack. For the first time in 3 years, Lisa was going to leave her garden for more than a day. Her sister's only daughter was getting married in Colorado, a 4-day trip that couldn't be missed. Lisa spent the entire week before her departure preparing her plants as if she were leaving children with a babysitter. The tomatoes need water every other day, but just at the roots, not the leaves, she explained to Tommy, the 14-year-old boy from down the street who had eagerly accepted the job of garden watcher. His freckled face looked serious as he scribbled notes. "And if the zucchini gets bigger than your forearm, pick it. Don't wait." Tommy nodded, pencil flying across his notepad. "What about the motion lights, the ones Mr. Thompson put up?" Lisa sighed. "Just ignore them. And if Alan says anything to you, just be polite and tell him you're taking care of things for me." Before leaving, Lisa set up the small security camera she had bought last fall after finding some of her garden ornaments mysteriously broken. She positioned it under the eaves of her tool shed, its lens capturing most of the main garden beds. It wasn't that she didn't trust Tommy. The camera was more for her peace of mind, a way to peek at her beloved plants while she was away. The wedding was beautiful. Lisa's niece glowed in white lace, and for a few days Lisa allowed herself to forget about the growing tension back home. She called Tommy each evening, getting cheerful reports that everything was fine. "I picked 3 huge zucchinis," he told her on the second night. "And I haven't seen Mr. Thompson at all." That should have been her first warning. Alan Thompson was never invisible. As her flight approached her hometown on Monday afternoon, Lisa felt the familiar flutter of excitement she always got when returning to her garden after time away. There would be changes. New blooms, ripened. Vegetables, perhaps a visiting butterfly she hadn't seen before. The living world never stayed still, and that was its magic. The taxi turned onto Oak Street just as the evening light was turning golden, Lisa's favorite time in the garden, when the setting sun made everything glow. But as the car pulled up to her house, something felt wrong. The usual riot of colors that greeted her from the front yard looked muted, dull. Must be the light, she muttered to herself, paying the driver and pulling her suitcase up the front walk. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The hydrangeas by the steps, which should have been bobbing with blue puffball blooms, hung limp and brown. The climbing roses along the porch railing had shriveled, their leaves curled like fingers, clenching in pain. Lisa dropped her suitcase and ran to the backyard gate, her heart hammering. She fumbled with the latch, pushed through, and then froze, a sound escaping her that was somewhere between a gasp and a moan. Her garden, her beautiful, living garden, was dying. No, not dying. Dead. Every plant, from the tallest sunflower to the smallest herb, had withered. The lush green world she had left 4 days ago was now a landscape of brown. Leaves curled and blackened. Stems bent as if in agony. Flowers shriveled into unrecognizable husks. Even the sturdy old oak tree at the back corner had patches of brown spreading through its canopy. No, 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 Lisa whispered, stumbling forward. She knelt beside her tomato plants, her grandmother's treasured heirlooms, and reached out with trembling fingers. The plants crumbled at her touch, disintegrating into brittle pieces. The few tomatoes that had been ripening now sat wrinkled and leaking on the ground, surrounded by a strange white crust that covered the soil. It was this white substance that made Lisa's blood run cold. She picked up a pinch, touched it to her tongue, and quickly spat it out. Salt. The whole garden was covered in salt. This wasn't some disease or a watering mistake. This was deliberate destruction. Behind her, the gate latch clicked. Tommy stood, there, his young face twisted with distress, tears tracking down his cheeks. "I'm sorry, Miss Lisa," he choked out. "I came every day like I promised. Everything was fine yesterday morning, I swear it was. Then I had baseball practice, and when I came back in the evening, it was like this." He wiped his nose with his sleeve. "I tried watering everything extra, but it didn't help. Nothing helped." Lisa stood slowly, her knees dirt-stained and shaky. "It's not your fault, Tommy," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This wasn't something you could have fixed with water." As the reality sank in, Lisa felt a familiar emptiness spreading inside her chest, the same hollow feeling she'd had when she found her husband's goodbye note 3 years ago. Once again, something precious had been taken from her. Only this time, she knew exactly who was responsible. She remembered the security camera with a jolt of hope. Running to the tool shed, she retrieved the small device and brought it inside to her computer. Her hands shook as she downloaded the footage, scanning backward through hours of daylight and darkness. There, at 2:17 a.m., when the street was silent and dark, a figure entered the frame. Even in the grainy night vision footage, Alan's stiff posture was unmistakable. He moved methodically through her garden, carrying a large bag from which he scattered white crystals in wide arcs across her carefully tended beds. He worked with the efficiency of someone who had planned his actions carefully, making sure no corner of the garden was spared. Most chilling was the expression on his face, clearly visible when he turned toward the camera he hadn't noticed. It wasn't anger that drove him, or even the irritation he usually displayed. It was satisfaction, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he poisoned years of living growth. At one point he paused by her treasured tomato plants. The camera caught him touching one of the green fruits, then deliberately upending his bag of salt directly onto the roots. His smile widened. When he left an hour later, Lisa's garden was doomed, sentenced to a slow death by salt that would make the soil itself toxic for months, maybe years to come. Lisa watched the footage twice, her initial shock hardening into something else entirely. The garden had been her healing place after loss, her way of creating beauty from emptiness. Alan hadn't just killed plants. He had attacked her recovery, her joy, her hard-won peace. As the sun set on her ruined sanctuary, Lisa made 2 phone calls. The first was to the police. The second was to her sister. "Remember when you said I should consider getting a lawyer about the property line dispute?" she said when her sister answered. "I think it's time. The community response, the police came that same evening. Officer Bailey, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, walked through the ruined garden with Lisa, taking photos and notes. When Lisa showed her the security footage, the officer's professional calm slipped for just a moment. "That's deliberate," she said, watching Alan methodically spreading salt. "Premeditated property damage. We'll pay Mr. Thompson a visit tonight." As Officer Bailey left, promising to return with updates, Lisa sat alone on her back steps. The garden that had been her refuge now looked like a battlefield. Even in the growing darkness, she could see the extent of the destruction. 3 years of work, hundreds of plants, countless hours of care, all killed in a single night of cruelty. Lisa didn't cry. She was beyond tears now. Instead, she felt a strange emptiness, like the garden's death had hollowed something out inside her too. She didn't notice Tommy until he was standing right in front of her, shuffling his feet awkwardly. "I brought my dad," he said, gesturing to a tall man walking through the gate. "He knows about plants and stuff." Mr. Chen nodded solemnly to Lisa. He was the quiet father from 3 houses down, who worked as a landscaper for the city parks. "Tommy told me." "What happened?" he said. "May I?" He gestured toward the garden. Lisa nodded, too tired to speak. Mr. Chen walked carefully through the dead plants, occasionally kneeling to examine the soil. When he returned, his face was serious, but not without hope. "Salt damage is bad," he said simply, "but not impossible. The soil needs to be removed, at least the top layer, maybe more. Then new soil brought in." He looked at Lisa directly. "It's a big job. Too big for one person." Before Lisa could respond, Tommy blurted out, "We could help. Me and Dad, and I bet others would too." Mr. Chen put his hand on his son's shoulder. "We've enjoyed your garden for years," he told Lisa. "The whole neighborhood has. Maybe it's time we gave something back." That night, Tommy and his father made calls. By morning, messages were spreading across the neighborhood text group and the community Facebook page. The story of Alan's midnight attack struck a nerve with everyone who heard it. Lisa's garden had been a quiet landmark, a place that marked the seasons for the whole street. Its destruction felt personal, even to neighbors who barely knew Lisa. By 10 o'clock Saturday morning, people began arriving at Lisa's house. They came with shovels and wheelbarrows, work gloves and determination. Mr. Wilson brought his pickup truck. Mrs. Henderson arrived with a cooler full of sandwiches and lemonade. The Collins family came as a unit, even the teenagers who normally wouldn't be caught dead doing yard work on a weekend. "I heard what happened," said Mrs. Patel from the blue house on the corner, a woman Lisa had only waved to in passing before. "My husband and I want to help. He's bringing compost from our garden center. No charge, of course." Lisa stood speechless as her yard filled with neighbors, some familiar, some she barely knew. Mr. Chen had taken charge somehow, organizing people into teams. Some were carefully digging up the dead plants, saving what could be saved. Others formed a bucket brigade, removing the contaminated soil to a growing pile by the curb. "The city's sending a truck for the soil," explained Officer Bailey, who had returned in civilian clothes, ready to work, "and they're waiving the disposal fee." Turns out the Parks Department wasn't too happy to hear about someone deliberately killing plants. By noon, nearly 30 people were working in Lisa's yard. The Chen family carefully dug around the roots of her grandmother's dead tomato plants, preserving what they could of the root balls that might still hold life. Tommy and his friends tackled the heavy work with the energy only teenagers possess, competing to fill wheelbarrows the fastest. The local garden club arrived at 1 o'clock, bringing flats of seedlings and small plants. "We can't replace everything," said their president, a silver-haired woman who introduced herself as Pat, "but we can give you a start." Most touching were the small personal offerings. Mr. Wilson silently handed Lisa a small clay pot containing a cutting from his prized rose bush. "It was my late wife's favorite," he said simply. Mrs. Collins brought packets of seeds saved from her mother's garden in Mexico. "They grow like crazy," she promised. "Just like your spirit." As the afternoon wore on, the impossible began to happen. The poisoned soil disappeared, replaced by rich black earth donated by Mr. Patel's garden center. New wooden borders defined the beds, built from lumber provided by someone's brother who worked at the hardware store. Small green plants stood in tentative rows, not the lush growth of before, but a promise of what could be again. During a water break, Lisa found herself sitting beside Pat from the garden club. "I don't understand," Lisa said, watching the busy scene in her yard. "Some of these people, I barely know them." Pat smiled. "Gardens aren't just for the gardener," she said. "They're for everyone who passes by, everyone who sees the beauty you've created. Your garden has been giving to this neighborhood for years. Now the neighborhood is giving back." As the sun began to set, people gathered in a circle in what had been the center of the garden. Where Lisa's favorite bench had once stood surrounded by flowers, there was now a new bench, a surprise gift from the neighbors, delivered while Lisa had been helping with planting. "We have one more thing," said Mr. Chen, nodding to his son. Tommy stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. He opened it carefully to reveal 5 tiny seedlings, their stems fragile but undeniably alive. "We saved these from your special tomato plants," Tommy explained, his voice cracking with pride. "Mr. Johnson, he's a botanist at the community college. He helped us. They're babies from the roots that weren't too damaged. Your grandmother's tomatoes. They'll grow again." Lisa took the box with trembling hands. The tiny plants looked nothing like the sturdy tomato vines that had been her pride and joy, but they were alive. Against all odds, against deliberate destruction, life had persisted. Looking around at the circle of faces, dirty, tired, but shining with accomplishment, Lisa felt the hollow feeling inside her begin to fill. Alan had taken her garden, but he had given her something she hadn't even known she needed: her community. Justice and rebirth. The court date was set for 3 weeks after the incident. Lisa arrived early, dressed in clothes that felt strangely formal after weeks of dirt-stained work clothes. Her lawyer, a former gardener himself, had prepared meticulously, organizing the security footage, photos of the damage, and estimates of the financial loss. 3 years of work doesn't have a price tag, Lisa had told him when they met. "How do you put a dollar amount on my grandmother's tomatoes?" "We'll find a way," he had promised. And they had, documenting every plant, every hour of labor, every bag of soil and homemade trellis that had gone into creating the garden. Lisa sat quietly in the courtroom, watching as other cases were called before hers. Her sister squeezed her hand occasionally, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. In the gallery behind them sat several neighbors: Mr. Chen and Tommy, Mrs. Henderson, even Pat from the garden club. When Alan finally walked in with his lawyer, Lisa felt a strange calm settle over her. He looked smaller somehow, his perfect posture slightly stooped, his carefully combed hair seeming thin and gray under the harsh courtroom lights. When he glanced in her direction, his eyes slid away quickly, unable to hold her gaze. "Case number 47293, Thompson versus Richards, property damage," called the clerk. The judge was a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She listened attentively as Lisa's lawyer presented the evidence, the security footage playing on a small screen for the court to see, the before and after photos of the garden, the soil analysis confirming high salt content. Alan's lawyer argued that it had been a neighborhood dispute that got out of hand, describing Lisa's garden as an eyesore that had decreased property values. But his words rang hollow against the stark evidence of Alan methodically salting the earth in the dead of night. When it was Alan's turn to speak, he straightened his tie and cleared his throat. "I was simply trying to maintain neighborhood standards," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Her plants were invading my property. I asked her repeatedly to keep things tidy." The judge peered at him over her glasses. "So you decided that poisoning your neighbor's entire garden with salt in the middle of the night was an appropriate response to some vines on a fence?" Alan shifted uncomfortably. "I may have overreacted." "Overreacted?" The judge's voice was quiet but cutting. "Mr. Thompson, what you did wasn't an overreaction. It was a calculated act of destruction. The footage shows you spending over an hour deliberately applying salt to every part of Ms. Richard's garden. That's not a momentary lapse in judgment. That's premeditated malice. When the judgment came, it was decisive. Alan was ordered to pay for the full restoration of Lisa's garden, nearly $15,000. Additionally, he would perform 200 hours of community service at the city botanical gardens. Perhaps working with plants will give you a better appreciation for them, the judge said dryly. She also granted Lisa's request for a restraining order, requiring Alan to maintain a respectful distance and prohibiting any interference with her property. As they left the courtroom, Lisa felt no triumph, just a quiet relief that justice had been served. The money would help with the ongoing restoration, but it couldn't replace what had been lost. Some things, once destroyed, could never be exactly the same again. What surprised her was how quickly Alan seemed to crumble after the judgment. The smug confidence that had defined him vanished, replaced by a hunched defensiveness. Neighbors who had once tolerated his fussy complaints now turned away when they saw him coming. Even his perfect lawn lost its luster as he spent weekends at the botanical gardens instead of overseeing his weekly lawn service. 2 months after the court case, a for sale sign appeared in front of Alan's house. He moved out on a rainy Tuesday, his moving truck half empty compared to when he had arrived. No one came to say goodbye. Meanwhile, Lisa's garden was slowly coming back to life. Not the same as before, it couldn't be, but something new and equally special was emerging. The layout was different now, designed with input from neighbors who had helped with the restoration. Mr. Chen had suggested a small pond near the center, which now bubbled cheerfully with a solar-powered fountain. Mrs. Patel had helped plan a spice garden with plants from her native India that filled the air with exotic scents. Most precious of all were the 5 tomato plants grown from the rescued seedlings of her grandmother's heirlooms. They were thriving now, climbing strong up the new trellises built by Tommy and his friends. The first tiny green tomatoes had appeared just last week, promising that the family legacy would continue. One evening in late summer, as golden light slanted across the new garden, Lisa hosted a thank you dinner for everyone who had helped. Tables were set up on the lawn, covered with mismatched tablecloths and jars of fresh flowers. People brought dishes to share: Mrs. Henderson's famous potato salad, Mr. Wilson's grilled corn, the Chen family's dumplings. As they ate and laughed together, Lisa looked around at what had grown from the ashes of destruction. Not just plants, but connections. The Collins kids now stopped by regularly to help with weeding. Mrs. Patel taught Lisa how to dry herbs the way her grandmother had shown her. Tommy had discovered a passion for gardening and was saving for horticulture classes at the community college. After dinner, as twilight softened the edges of the world, Pat from the garden club stood and raised her glass. "To Lisa," she said, "whose garden brought beauty to our street. And to all of us who discovered that we were more than just neighbors, we were a community waiting to bloom." Glasses clinked as everyone toasted. In the center of the main garden bed stood a small copper plaque, a gift from the neighborhood. It read simply, "What salt destroys, community restores." The new family that moved into Alan's house a month later turned out to be enthusiastic gardeners themselves. The husband stopped by one day while Lisa was planting fall bulbs. "We've heard so much about your garden," he said shyly. "Would you mind if our kids came over sometimes to learn? They've never grown anything before." Lisa smiled and handed him a trowel. "There's no better time to start than now," she said, "and I happen to have some extra tomato seeds I've been saving for someone special." As they worked side by side, digging small holes for hope to grow in, Lisa realized something important. Alan had tried to take her garden, her joy, her peace. Instead, he had inadvertently given her the greatest gift of all: the knowledge that she was not alone, that beauty, once created, ripples outward in ways no one can predict or destroy. In the corner of the yard, the first monarch butterfly of the season landed on a newly planted milkweed. Life, persistent and stubborn, continued its ancient cycle of destruction and renewal. And this time, it had witnesses who understood its value. a community that had discovered its strength in the face of senseless destruction. Together, they would grow something even more beautiful than before.